They called him a monster, a black stallion no one dared to touch. At a dusty Montana auction, the crowd mocked, the sheriff warned, and a ruthless landowner waited for him to fail. But when one grieving farmer stretched out his hand, everything began to change. What followed was a battle against storms, fear, and betrayal, until the moment the monster revealed a heart no one expected. The auction yard in Montana lay under a veil of dust that clung to every coat, every breath, every word that drifted through the dry air. It was autumn, and the wind carried the smell of hay mixed with exhaust fumes from the old trucks parked crookedly along the fence. Men with wide-brimmed hats leaned on the rails, murmuring as they watched a black horse being dragged into the pen. Its hide bore scars like lightning carved into dark clouds, its mane matted, its eyes wild with a grief no one cared to name. "They call him the monster," someone said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Meanest damn thing you'll ever see." Laughter rippled, low and cruel, as the horse jerked against the rope, baring teeth, not in defiance, but in a warning born from too many betrayals. Children clutched closer to their fathers' sides. No hands were raised. No bids were called. Luke Harrison stood at the far edge, hands sunk into the pockets of his worn denim jacket. He hadn't meant to stop here. He told himself he only came to town for tractor parts, maybe feed for the few cattle he had left. But something kept him rooted, eyes fixed on the creature pacing in circles as though trapped in a storm of its own making. At 55, Luke carried a quiet weight that bent his shoulders but never broke his stance. The townsfolk knew his story, even if they didn't speak it aloud. The farming accident last spring, the son gone too soon, the silence in Luke's house that no harvest could fill. Since then, neighbors had offered casseroles and condolences, but when the food cooled and the voices faded, only grief lingered like an uninvited tenant. Now, as the horse's hooves struck sparks from the packed dirt, Luke felt something shift inside him. He saw not a monster, but a mirror. A being scarred by hands that should have been gentle, left to circle the same patch of ground, restless, unwanted. The auctioneer's chant was half-hearted, a hollow rhythm bouncing off the tin roof. "Lot 31, Black Stallion, 7 years. Who will start me at 500? 4? 2? His voice cracked with indifference when no one answered. He shrugged at the handlers, already ready to move the horse out. The stallion threw its head high, nostrils flaring, the whites of its eyes flashing like torn cloth. Most stepped back, but Luke, against his better judgment, stepped closer. Dust swirled around his boots. He knew he should walk away. He had neither the money nor the strength for another burden. But grief makes strange choices. It pushes a man toward things that look as broken as he feels. He stopped at the fence, fingers curling over the rough wood. The horse turned, ears pinned flat, sides heaving, but its eyes locked on his. For a heartbeat, the noise of the yard vanished. Luke remembered the nights sitting in his empty kitchen, staring at his son's jacket still hanging by the door, wishing for one more chance to reach across the gulf of silence. He lifted his hand, palm up, a gesture small enough to be ignored, gentle enough to be safe. The crowd held its breath. "Crazy old fool," someone muttered. Yet the horse did not rear. It stood trembling, ears flicking, eyes searching. Dust floated between them like falling ash. The moment stretched, fragile as glass. And then, as if some invisible weight tipped, the stallion leaned forward, nostrils brushing the edge of Luke's hand. The touch was fleeting, just a breath against skin weathered by decades of plowing and planting. But to Luke, it was as though the earth had stilled. He felt the warmth of a life too long denied kindness, the pulse of a creature clinging to its last shred of trust. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The handlers exchanged glances. The auctioneer paused mid-word. For the first time in months, Luke's chest tightened not from grief, but from the flicker of something else. Something he hadn't dared feel. Purpose. He let his hand fall back slowly, not to take, but to offer, and the horse did not retreat. Their eyes held, man and beast, both bearing scars no one else wanted to see. Luke drew a breath that tasted of dust and memory. "Not a monster," he whispered, voice lost beneath the shuffle of boots and the drone of the auctioneer. "Just like me." The stallion shifted closer to the fence, a single step that changed everything. And Luke knew, with the certainty of a man who had already lost more than he could bear, that walking away was no longer an option. Luke's whisper still lingered in the dust as the handlers tugged on the rope, trying to drag the black stallion back toward the holding pen. The animal's ears pinned flat again, hooves scraping the packed dirt, but his gaze never left the man at the fence. Luke's hand, though lowered, remained open, steady as the prairie horizon. The auctioneer cleared his throat, embarrassed by the silence. "Lot 31, anyone? 200? 1?" But the crowd had lost interest in bidding. Their attention stayed fixed on the strange sight of a horse that had terrified everyone leaning toward the weathered farmer like a child hesitant to trust. Murmurs swelled, words like crazy, useless, and dangerous, yet Luke barely heard them. Something inside him, quiet but insistent, urged him not to step back. The horse's breath had warmed his palm only for a second, but that second had cracked open a door he thought forever closed. He remembered nights by the hospital bed, his son's skin pale under harsh fluorescent lights, his own helpless hand resting on a blanket that grew colder each day. That final touch, unanswered, had been his prison ever since. Now, standing before this scarred creature, another chance to reach had appeared. The handlers cursed under their breath, tightening their grip, but the stallion reared, shaking them off with a strength that scattered dust like smoke. Gasps echoed. Someone shouted, "Put him down before he kills somebody." Sheriff Collins stepped forward, one hand hovering near his belt, ready to intervene if things turned ugly. But Luke raised his voice, calm but firm. "Give him a minute." The sheriff hesitated. Collins had known Luke for decades, knew his steady work on the barley fields, knew the tragedy that had hollowed him out last spring. He saw in Luke's eyes not recklessness, but something deeper. A plea. He signaled the handlers to ease their ropes. Against their better judgment, they loosened, leaving the stallion free enough to choose. Luke took a breath heavy with dust and memories. Slowly, as though approaching a skittish bird, he lifted his hand again. The stallion's ears twitched, his muscles coiled, but he didn't retreat. Step by deliberate step, hooves striking soft thuds against the dirt, he moved toward the man who had not flinched. The world shrank until it was just the two of them, the scarred horse and the farmer who carried scars no one could see. The crowd's whispers fell away. Even the auctioneer stopped his chant, letting silence wrap around the pen. Luke's palm hovered just inches from the muzzle, trembling only slightly. The stallion stretched his neck, nostrils flaring, testing the air thick with hay, sweat, and something unfamiliar. Patience. Then, like a shadow passing into light, the horse pressed his muzzle into Luke's hand. Not with force, not with fear, but with the fragile weight of surrender. The touch was real this time, warm and steady. Luke's breath caught. He did not move, did not grasp, only let the moment stand on its own. His thumb brushed the coarse hairs of the stallion's nose, and in that simple act, something unspoken passed between them. The crowd erupted, half in disbelief, half in awe. "I'll be damned," someone muttered. Maggie Dawson, the town's veterinarian, pushed forward, her eyes wide. She had tended countless animals, but had never seen this so quickly. She caught Luke's glance, and though she didn't speak, her face carried both warning and wonder. "Not a monster," Luke said softly, echoing his earlier words, though this time the horse seemed to hear them. The stallion let out a long breath, ears flicking forward. His body relaxed, just slightly, enough to reveal the truth. He wasn't fighting to be vicious. He was fighting to be understood. The handlers exchanged worried looks. One whispered to the sheriff, "This ain't safe." But Collins only folded his arms, watching. He wasn't sure what he believed, only that something was happening here none of them had expected. The auctioneer, sensing no sale from the crowd, finally snapped, "Fine, sold for 50 if anyone's fool enough to take him." His eyes swept the ring, mocking. No hands rose. No one wanted the burden. No one but Luke. Luke's hand stayed on the stallion's muzzle, and he felt the animal's breath against his wrist like the slow tide of the sea. He thought of his empty farmhouse, the quiet that pressed in each evening like a weight. He thought of his son's laughter carried off by wind that never returned. And he thought of this horse, standing alone in a pen while the world called him names he didn't deserve. The decision was no decision at all. It came like the turning of a season, inevitable, unstoppable. Luke lifted his eyes to the auctioneer and said, "Clear and steady. I'll take him." The yard fell silent. Then a ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd. Some laughed, others shook their heads, and one voice called out, "You'll regret it, Harrison." But Luke didn't answer. His hand remained on the stallion, who, though still trembling, had not stepped away. For the first time in months, Luke felt alive, not healed, not whole, but moving, as if grief itself had shifted to make room for something new. He gave the horse one last stroke along the muzzle, then lowered his hand. The stallion tossed his head, but stayed near, as though unwilling to let the connection break. Luke turned, dust clinging to his boots, and walked toward the office to sign the papers that would change both their lives. Behind him, the stallion let out a deep, rolling snort, the kind that sounds less like defiance and more like relief. And though the crowd still whispered "monster," Luke carried with him the certainty that he had just touched something sacred. The papers were thin, just a single sheet with numbers scrawled in ink, but to Luke, they felt heavier than stone. His calloused hands trembled as he slid the worn wallet from his pocket. The last of his savings, meant for seed, maybe for repairs to the old combine that coughed smoke every other morning, lay in crumpled bills. He counted them twice, then once more for good measure. It wasn't enough for comfort, but it was enough for this one reckless act. $100 to start, the auctioneer muttered, still doubtful that anyone sane would actually follow through. When no one else spoke, he shrugged. Fine. Sold to Harrison. The gavel hit the table with a hollow crack that echoed across the yard. A ripple of laughter followed. Someone whistled, long and low, as if to say goodbye to the man's common sense. Luke signed the receipt with a hand that no longer shook. The clerk, a boy barely old enough to shave, looked at him with something between pity and curiosity. "Sir, you sure about this? That horse has got a record longer than Main Street." Luke tucked the paper into his jacket. "Records don't tell the whole story." He turned toward the pen where the black stallion stood restless, rope tugged by two handlers struggling to keep him still. The horse snorted, ears swiveling, but his gaze sought Luke immediately, as though he knew something had shifted. Their fragile thread of trust held. Luke stepped closer, ignoring the jeers. Sheriff Collins intercepted him before he could reach the gate. "Luke, you lost your mind? That animal's dangerous. Mean as sin. You don't have the land or the time to deal with him." Luke didn't argue. He only said, "I don't have the land or the time for much anymore, Sheriff, but I've got enough for him." The sheriff studied his face for a long moment. He saw not recklessness, but a man who'd lost nearly everything and refused to lose this too. Finally, Collins sighed. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The handlers opened the gate, and the stallion lunged, muscles rippling under scarred hide. Luke stood his ground. He didn't try to grab the rope, didn't fight. He simply walked alongside, voice low, steady as rain on an old tin roof. "Easy now. We'll figure it out." The crowd scattered as the stallion passed, hooves striking sparks from the gravel. Luke guided him toward the faded stock trailer hitched to his aging pickup. The trailer had hauled grain, bales of hay, and once, years ago, a calf for 4-H that his son had raised. Now it rattled, as if unsure it could carry the weight of something so volatile. Loading was a battle. The stallion balked at the ramp, eyes rolling white. He reared, jerking the rope, nearly knocking Luke off his feet. Dust filled his throat, stung his eyes. He could hear the mutters from behind. He won't load. He'll never load. But Luke didn't raise his voice or his hand. He stood at the base of the ramp, pulled an apple from his pocket, a habit carried from years of keeping small treats for farm dogs and calves, and held it out. His son had once done the same with a skittish pony, laughing when the animal lipped the fruit from his palm. The memory ached, but Luke leaned into it. The stallion hesitated, nostrils flaring at the scent. Hunger won over fear. Slowly, warily, he stretched his neck and took the apple. Luke stepped backward up the ramp, leaving space, never tugging. One cautious step, then another, and finally the black hooves struck the trailer floor. The gate slammed shut behind them, handlers sighing in relief. As Luke climbed into the cab of his truck, a voice called from the crowd. "Harrison, that horse'll ruin you!" Laughter followed. He didn't answer. The old pickup groaned as he turned the key, but the engine caught. Through the rearview mirror, Luke saw the stallion's dark shape shifting inside the trailer, ears swiveling, restless but contained. The road home was 15 miles of gravel and fading asphalt, each bump rattling the trailer, each rattle reminding Luke of the risk he had just taken. He thought of bills waiting unpaid on the kitchen table, of fields that should already be plowed, of nights spent staring at the empty chair across from his own. Yet for the first time since the accident, silence didn't feel like suffocation. It felt like possibility. At a red light in town, Maggie Dawson waved him down, her truck pulling alongside. She rolled down her window, her brown hair pulled back under a cap dusted with hay. "Luke, tell me you didn't." He offered a tired smile. I did. She glanced toward the trailer, worry etched deep on her face. That animal's been through hell. You can't fix him overnight. Maybe not ever. Luke gripped the wheel. Maybe I'm not trying to fix him. Maybe I'm just trying to keep him alive. Maggie stared at him, then shook her head. Call me when you need a vet. And you will. She drove off, leaving Luke with nothing but the hum of his old engine and the steady thud of hooves behind him. When he reached his farm, the sun was low, staining the sky a weary gold. He backed the trailer up to the barn, the structure leaning like an old man but still standing. The stallion exploded from the ramp, nearly tearing free. He bolted to the far corner of the pasture, chest heaving, legs stiff with fear. Luke stood in the settling dust, rope limp in his hand, watching the horse circle like a storm looking for landfall. The air smelled of dry earth and sweat. He felt a twinge of doubt heavier than any burden he had carried. Still, as the stallion stopped at the fence line, sides quivering, eyes burning into Luke's, the farmer whispered again, softer than the evening wind, "We'll figure it out." The words were not for reassurance. They were a vow. The barn creaked like an old man's bones as Luke swung the wide doors open. Its timbers had held through blizzards and drought, though termites had chewed their way through the beams in places, and the roof let in more light than it kept out. Dust rose in soft spirals, mingling with the smell of dry hay stacked unevenly in the loft. This barn had once echoed with the laughter of a boy brushing down a chestnut gelding after chores. Now it was hollow, a shell waiting to be filled again. The stallion did not want to be led inside. He planted his hooves at the threshold, ears flat, eyes darting to every corner, as if the shadows themselves carried threats. Luke didn't tug hard on the rope. He simply stood, breathing slow, letting the horse test the air. "It's nothing fancy," he murmured, voice low and steady. "But it's all I've got." Minutes stretched before the stallion flicked an ear, snorted, and took one cautious step across the sill. His hooves rang against the wooden planks. Luke led him into the largest stall, the one that had been empty since the accident last spring. He unlatched the rope and stepped back, leaving the horse free to claim the space or reject it. The stallion spun once, nostrils flaring, then shoved his weight against the stall boards with a force that rattled the nails. Luke winced. He knew the lumber wouldn't hold forever. Still, he stood quiet, watching. He spread fresh hay, filled the water trough, then leaned against the door. The horse's sides heaved like bellows. Sweat darkened his coat, highlighting the pale scars. Luke recognized that restless pacing. It mirrored the way he had walked the length of his kitchen each night, unable to sleep, staring at the empty chair his son had once filled. The stallion's hooves beat the same rhythm. Loss made into motion. When darkness fell, the barn settled into stillness broken only by the rustle of hay and the creak of timbers shifting in the cooling air. Luke set a lantern on a peg, its light painting long shadows. He pulled a chair near the stall and sat, elbows on his knees, as if keeping vigil. He didn't reach for the horse again. He only spoke into the quiet, not sure if he was heard. "Didn't plan on this," he admitted. "Didn't plan on much of anything after he was gone." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "Maybe you didn't plan on me either, but here we are, 2 strays left behind." The stallion stopped pacing, ears flicking toward the sound. He did not approach, but neither did he turn away. For Luke, that was enough. Later, when he rose stiffly from the chair and walked back toward the house, the night air smelled of sage and dust. Coyotes yipped somewhere beyond the fence line. Luke paused on the porch, looking back. The lantern's glow seeped through the barn slats. Inside, a restless shadow shifted, but did not crash against the walls again. It was a start. The next morning broke sharp and cold, frost glazing the stubble of harvested barley fields. Luke carried a bucket of oats into the barn. The stallion eyed him with suspicion. Ears angled back, but hunger pressed him forward. He sniffed the feed, then plunged his muzzle into the bucket, chewing noisily. Luke leaned on the post, watching, relief settling in his chest like a fragile ember. "Good," he whispered. "Eat. That's how we begin." The days stretched into a pattern. Luke mended fence lines by day and sat in the barn by night, talking about weather, about repairs, about nothing at all. The stallion never answered, but his ears shifted when Luke spoke, as though words were a language he almost understood. Each evening, Luke left the stall door closed but unlatched. Trust offered, not forced. The horse never tried to push it open. Neighbors began to notice the black shape moving in the pasture. Some stopped at the roadside, shaking their heads. "Harrison's lost it," they said. "That horse will kill him sooner or later." Their words carried on the wind, but Luke let them pass. He had heard worse. At sunset one evening, the stallion came close to the fence, muscles taut but no longer coiled in panic. Luke stood on the other side, arms draped over the top rail, saying nothing. Silence stretched between them, soft but alive. The sky burned orange, behind the horse's silhouette, and Luke thought of how grief sometimes glows brightest before it cools into ash. As he turned toward the house, he let himself smile. Small, fleeting, but real. The stallion snorted behind him, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. A sound like a door cracking open. Luke whispered, barely audible against the prairie wind, "We'll make this home, you and I, no matter how broken it is." The first nights were the hardest. The stallion did not sleep, or if he did, it was only in fits, short bursts of stillness broken by sudden jerks of his head, a pounding hoof against the stall, the wild snort of an animal convinced danger lingered in every shadow. Luke listened from his house at the edge of the pasture, the restless sounds carrying through the brittle night air. Each slam of hooves against the barn walls echoed in his chest like a heart refusing peace. On the third night, Luke gave up on his bed. He pulled on his boots, wrapped himself in a flannel coat, and walked back out beneath a sky heavy with stars. Frost slicked the grass, crunching beneath his steps. The barn glowed faintly with lantern light left burning low, as though some part of him already knew he would return. He slid into the chair by the stall, leaning back until the wood creaked, and let his breath match the rhythm of the horse's pacing. "Can't sleep either, huh?" he said softly. His voice rose into the rafters, mingled with the smell of hay and old dust. The stallion stopped, ears flicked toward him, then resumed his circuit. Luke lowered his eyes to the floor. "I used to walk the same way, back and forth, kitchen to hallway. Couldn't stop myself. Thought maybe if I kept moving I wouldn't feel it as much." He did not say his son's name. Not yet. Even in the quiet of an empty barn, the word felt too sharp, like glass in his mouth. But he spoke of the silence, of how the house had turned hollow after the accident, of how the fields themselves had grown heavy, as if mocking him with their endless cycles of planting and dying. The stallion slowed. His dark shape hovered near the slats, ears tipped forward. Luke leaned closer, elbows on his knees. "I don't expect you to understand," he said. "But maybe you do. Maybe you know what it's like to be left in a place that used to mean something and now feels like nothing at all." Wind pressed against the barn walls, whistling through the cracks. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, answered by another farther away. The horse stilled, tail swishing, eyes bright in the lamplight. For the first time since he had brought him home, Luke thought he saw less fury there, and more listening. He began to fill the silence with words he had not spoken to another soul. He talked about the years when his boy had helped him mend fences, about the way laughter could fill a space so completely it seemed like it would never fade. He confessed how he had failed to keep the farm alive afterward, how bills piled up like fallen leaves, how some mornings he could barely drag himself out of bed. The stallion did not flinch or turn away. He only stood, muscles quivering, ears tuned to the voice that had steadied into something almost prayerful. When Luke finally stopped, the quiet felt different, no longer heavy, but waiting. He rubbed his face with tired hands. "Guess you're the only one who'll listen these days." His laugh was dry, broken at the edges. The stallion took one step closer to the door, breath fogging through the slats. He stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as though testing the truth in Luke's words. The farmer held his ground, not daring to reach this time. It was enough to feel the warm breath linger between them. Night after night, the ritual repeated. Luke brought a chair, sometimes a book, sometimes just his voice. He read aloud from the newspaper or recited recipes his wife had once marked in the margins of an old cookbook. He told the horse about weather forecasts, about the failing combine, about little things that filled the silence. The stallion never answered, but his pacing grew shorter, his outbursts less violent. The barn walls no longer shook like drums of war. They hummed instead, with the quiet of two broken souls sharing the same vigil. On the 7th night, rain began to fall, a soft drizzle tapping on the tin roof. Luke leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, letting the rhythm soothe him. When he opened them again, the stallion stood directly at the stall door, ears pricked, eyes fixed on him. Luke drew a breath, steady and slow. "You hear it too, don't you? The sound of something softer than what we've known." The horse did not retreat. He lowered his head until his muzzle touched the wooden beam. Luke lifted his hand, palm flat, and set it gently on the same spot from the other side. They were separated by a sliver of wood, yet the connection was undeniable. Man and animal, both marked by scars, finding shelter not in walls but in the fragile promise of presence. When Luke rose at dawn, stiff and weary, the stallion was finally lying down in the hay, sides rising and falling in sleep. Luke stepped quietly out of the barn, boots sinking into damp earth. The world smelled fresh, rinsed clean by the night's rain. For the first time in months, he felt as though he had slept, though he had not closed his eyes once. He paused on the path back to the house, glancing over his shoulder. Through the slats of the barn, the dark shape lay curled, breathing steady. Luke let a whisper slip into the cool morning air. "Maybe we'll both rest now." The quiet routine of nights in the barn could not hold forever. On the 10th day, Just as the morning sun climbed above the ridge and turned the barley stubble to gold, Luke heard the first real test arrive, not from the stallion, but from the world beyond. A truck rumbled up the gravel road, its chrome grille flashing in the light. Dust boiled behind it like a storm. Dean Harlow stepped out, his boots polished, his shirt starched crisp, smelling faintly of cologne even from 10 feet away. He carried himself like a man who owned everything his eyes landed on. Luke stiffened. He had known Dean since school days, knew his hunger for land, knew the way he circled like a hawk whenever a neighbor stumbled. "Well, Harrison," Dean said, voice smooth as oil, "heard you bought yourself a monster." His eyes slid toward the pasture where the black stallion stood at the fence line, head high, ears locked forward. "Surely you don't mean to keep him. Dangerous animal like that? Bad for property values." Luke kept his tone flat. "He's mine." Dean chuckled, shaking his head. "For now, but mark my words, one mistake, and the sheriff will be forced to put him down. And when that happens, well, maybe you'll think about selling this place. You can't work it alone forever." His smile thinned. "Everybody knows that." Before Luke could answer, the stallion shrieked. A high, tearing sound that split the morning. He lunged against the fence, hooves striking the rails hard enough to rattle nails. Dean flinched, stepping back quickly, color draining from his face. "See? Exactly what I'm talking about!" Luke's heart hammered. He moved slowly, steady as if approaching a cliff edge, and raised his voice just enough for the stallion to hear. "Easy, boy, easy now." His tone was calm, almost conversational. The horse's chest still heaved, eyes rolling white, but his ears twitched toward Luke's words. After a long minute, he backed away, snorting, though the tension clung to him like burrs. Dean laughed again, but it was thin, forced. "One of these days, Harrison, he'll turn on you. And when he does, don't expect sympathy. You've been warned." He climbed back into his truck, gravel spraying as he pulled away. The silence left behind was thick. Luke leaned against the fence, drawing slow breaths. The stallion paced along the boards, muscles rippling, but his gaze kept sliding back to Luke, as if searching for reassurance. "You held it together," Luke murmured. "That was the first test. You did better than either of us thought." But the trial was not over. That evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Wind bent the cottonwoods, thunder grumbled low, and rain lashed against the barn roof. Lightning split the sky, bright and violent. The stallion went wild. He reared, kicked, and slammed against the stall door. His fear was raw, a memory of past chains and blows rising with every crack of thunder. Luke rushed in, lantern swinging, the smell of ozone sharp in his nose. The barn shook with the horse's fury. For a moment, Luke thought he would tear the stall apart. He stepped inside, against every instinct, against every warning Maggie and the sheriff had given him. His boots slipped on wet straw, but he held his ground. "Listen to me," he said, voice steady though fear churned his gut. "It's just noise, just light. Nothing here is going to hurt you." He kept his palms open, visible. The stallion spun, eyes wide, ears pinned. Lightning flared, thunder crashed, and he lunged straight toward Luke. Instinct screamed to dive aside, but Luke stayed rooted. He closed his eyes, whispered, "I know. I know." At the last instant, the horse stopped. His chest pressed against Luke's, hot and shaking, breath pouring out in ragged bursts. Luke lifted a trembling hand and set it lightly against the stallion's neck. The hide was slick with sweat, the muscles quivering. "That's it," Luke whispered. "We stand it out together." For long minutes, they stayed that way, thunder cracking, rain hammering, man and beast leaning into each other as if holding back the storm itself. Slowly, the stallion's trembling eased. His head lowered, pressing into Luke's shoulder. Luke exhaled, not realizing until then that he had been holding his breath. When dawn finally broke, the storm spent, Luke staggered out of the stall exhausted, but alive. The barn smelled of wet hay and sweat, but also of something else. Trust. Fragile, but real. The stallion lay down in the straw for the first time since coming to the farm, eyes half-lidded, ears relaxed. Luke leaned against the doorway, body aching, clothes damp, but his heart steadier than it had been in months. "You passed," he said softly, though the words felt as much for himself as for the horse. Outside, the sun lit the drenched fields, each droplet shining like a small promise. The trial had come, and somehow they had endured it together. The morning after the storm, the air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Mist clung to the fields like thin gauze, and the stallion, though calmer than the night before, still carried tension in the way his ears twitched at every sound. Luke leaned on the fence, sipping black coffee gone lukewarm, watching the animal graze at a cautious distance. He thought the worst of the storm had passed. He didn't expect another kind of storm to walk right up the dirt road toward him. A lanky boy in a faded hoodie, jeans torn at the knees, appeared at the gate. Luke recognized him immediately. Ethan Miller, the neighbor kid whose father had died in a farming accident 2 years back. Since then, Ethan had been living with his grandmother, a woman too old to rein in the restless grief of a 14-year-old. Ethan's eyes locked on the stallion with a mixture of awe and defiance. "That's the horse everyone's talking about," he said, voice cracking but bold. "The monster." Luke set his mug on the fence post. "That's what they call him. Doesn't mean it's true." The boy hooked his fingers in the wire fence, leaning closer. "He looks mean enough. Bet he could kill a man if he wanted." The stallion lifted his head at the sound of the boy's voice, ears flicking back. Luke kept his tone steady. "He's not mean. He's scared. There's a difference." Ethan shrugged, though his gaze never left the horse. "Same difference, far as I can see." He hesitated, then asked, "Can I get closer?" Luke studied him. The boy's shoulders were set like a challenge, but beneath it Luke saw something familiar. The hollow look of someone carrying loss heavier than his frame. He recognized it because he wore it himself. Still, he shook his head. "Not yet. He's not ready." The answer didn't sit well. Ethan kicked at a rock, sending it skittering along the dirt. "You think you're the only one who can handle him?" Luke sighed. "I think I'm the only one who'll wait as long as it takes." For a while they stood in silence. The stallion dropped his head again to graze, though his eyes stayed on the boy. Ethan shifted from one foot to the other. "My dad used to tell me wild things just need someone to prove they won't leave. Guess he was right." His voice thinned on the last word. Luke felt the air tighten between them. He remembered a boy's laughter echoing in this very pasture, the same age as Ethan, before a single misstep had turned laughter into silence. He swallowed. "Your dad was a smart man." That afternoon, Luke found Ethan perched on the fence again, despite his earlier warning. The boy held out a carrot stolen from his grandmother's garden. The stallion pinned his ears, snorting, taking a sharp step forward. Luke shouted, "Ethan, get back!" But the boy held his ground. His hand trembled, yet he didn't drop the carrot. For a moment, Luke's chest seized with fear. He saw again the flash of metal, the sirens from last spring, the feeling of being too late. He rushed forward, ready to drag Ethan down if the horse lunged. Then the stallion stopped. His nostrils flared, breath loud, but instead of striking, he froze. The air between boy and horse thickened with some fragile recognition. Ethan's shoulders loosened slightly. See? He just wanted to know if I'd run. Luke grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him down from the fence. His voice was sharp with more fear than anger. Don't ever test him like that again. Not unless you're ready for the ground to break under you. Ethan jerked free, glaring. Maybe he's not the only one tired of people being scared of him. He shoved his hands into his hoodie and stalked away, kicking dust as he went. Luke stood frozen, heart pounding, the stallion still watching from the pasture. He knew the boy's reckless defiance wasn't born from bravery, but from hurt, from trying to wrestle with an emptiness that had no shape. He couldn't blame him. Yet the thought of another young life colliding with grief was almost more than he could stand. That night, Luke sat on the porch as crickets sang in the grass. He thought about Ethan's words, about the raw need hidden behind them. The stallion paced the pasture line, black against the silver moonlight. Two broken boys, one human, one horse, both pushing against fences no one else could see. Luke whispered into the night, as though to both of them, "You're not monsters. You're just trying to find a way back." Inside the barn, the stallion snorted, and out on the dirt road, a boy's footprints still marked the dust. Luke understood then that the horse wasn't the only soul who had come into his life needing patience. Autumn deepened in Montana, the mornings sharper now, breath visible in white puffs as Luke carried hay to the pasture. Frost rimmed the fence rails, turning them silver in the dawn light. The stallion stood near the far corner, watching but not fleeing, his black coat shining like wet coal against the pale grass. Luke had begun to accept these small victories. A horse that no longer slammed against the boards, a presence that no longer felt like rage but wariness tempered by curiosity. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Maggie Dawson drove her old veterinary truck up the drive one afternoon, its tires crunching the gravel. She carried her worn leather bag in one hand and her clipboard in the other. "Heard you've been keeping that animal calmer than most folks thought possible," she said, sliding her cap back. "Mind if I take a look?" Luke hesitated, then nodded. Maggie had been his son's friend once, helping him prepare calves for the county fair. She knew horses better than most, and she carried the kind of honesty Luke both dreaded and trusted. They approached the stallion together. Maggie's movements were slow, practiced, her voice gentle as she murmured nonsense meant more for rhythm than meaning. The horse's ears flicked, but he didn't bolt. She ran her eyes along the scars that striped his neck and shoulders, the faint limp when he shifted weight on his left hind leg. "These aren't the marks of pasture fights," she said finally, her tone tightening. "They're too deliberate. Whip scars, barbed wire cuts. Someone used him hard. Too hard." She crouched, studying the leg. "And here, see that? Old fracture. He's been pushed past what he should have borne." Luke felt his throat close. The stallion snorted, shifting uneasily, as if echoing the weight of the words. Maggie straightened, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I'll tell you something else. This horse didn't come from nowhere. I've seen his brand before." She pulled a worn notebook from her bag, flipping through pages filled with sketches, notes, and registration numbers. Kentucky stock, high-value bloodline. He wasn't bred for pulling plows. He was bred for speed. Luke frowned, trying to reconcile the broken animal before him with the idea of a racehorse. Maggie tapped the scars again. Some owners push for trophies at any cost. When an animal refuses or breaks, they toss him aside. If he got sold at auction cheap, it's because somebody wanted to erase what they'd done. The truth landed heavier than any storm. The stallion wasn't cursed, wasn't born mean. He was carrying the violence of human ambition. Luke pressed a hand against the stall door, steadying himself. So they made him this way. Maggie's eyes softened. He's not beyond saving, but it'll take more patience than most people have. She closed the notebook. Question is, do you? Luke didn't answer right away. His gaze locked on the horse's dark eyes, the way they met his and then darted away, haunted but searching. He thought of Ethan's words about proving you wouldn't leave. He thought of his own nights pacing in grief, how quickly people had moved on while he remained stuck. I don't know, he admitted, but I want to try. That evening, after Maggie drove off, Ethan appeared again, hands shoved deep in his hoodie pocket. He leaned on the fence, silent at first. Finally, he said, My grandma told me that horse used to belong to rich folks. Said she heard it at the feed store. Luke nodded slowly. Maggie confirmed it. He wasn't born mean, people broke him. Ethan scowled at the ground, kicking dirt. Figures. Grown-ups always say it's the animal's fault when really it's theirs. His voice shook with something deeper than anger. Luke caught it, recognized it, the ache of a boy who still hadn't forgiven the world for taking his father. The stallion approached the fence then, ears forward, curious despite the tension in the air. Ethan straightened, hope flickering across his face. But when he lifted a tentative hand, the horse snorted sharply and backed away. The rejection was swift, final. Ethan's shoulders slumped. Guess he knows I'm not worth trusting. Luke wanted to protest, to tell the boy it wasn't about worth, only time. Instead, he said, It took me days before he'd even stand near. He doesn't give trust fast, but when he does, it means something. Ethan swallowed hard, then turned toward the road, muttering, Maybe he's smarter than most people I know. When the boy disappeared into the dust, Luke leaned against the fence. The stallion had returned to grazing, but his ears remained angled toward the farmhouse as though listening. Luke whispered into the cooling air, You're not a monster. You're proof that what's broken was once worth something. The horse lifted his head, eyes meeting Luke's in the dim light, and for a breath, the weight of both their secrets felt shared. The days grew shorter, each sunset pulling the cold down faster over the valley. Luke had settled into a rhythm. Chores in the morning, fence mending by day, quiet evenings spent in the barn. The stallion had stopped ramming the walls, though his eyes still flashed with caution. Trust was no longer an impossible dream. It was an ember, faint, but refusing to die. One evening, Luke carried a bucket of water fresh from the pump, steam rising in the chill air. He set it down and leaned against the stall door. The horse watched him with ears forward, tail swishing, hooves shifting, but not pounding. Luke reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an apple. He'd taken to keeping them handy, small offerings that said more than words could. He held the apple in his open palm. Here, he whispered. No tricks, just yours. The stallion snorted, breath fogging in the lamplight. He hesitated, as if measuring the distance not only in steps, but in trust. Slowly, with muscles taut as wire, he edged forward. His muzzle brushed Luke's hand, soft yet trembling. Then he took the apple, teeth crunching loud in the quiet barn. Luke didn't move. He let the horse chew, savoring the sound as though it were music. When the last bit was gone, the stallion did not retreat. Instead, he lowered his head, inch by inch, until his forehead rested briefly against Luke's chest. The farmer froze, breath caught. His hands hovered in the air, afraid that even the gentlest stroke might break the spell. He had known touches like this once. His son leaning against him after long days in the field, sweaty hair sticking to his brow, a tired but trusting weight. That memory surged now, filling the hollow space in Luke's chest until it hurt. At last, he let his hand fall, fingertips brushing the horse's neck. The skin quivered under the touch, but the stallion did not bolt. His head stayed lowered, steady against the man who had waited longer than he thought possible for this single moment. Luke whispered, "That's it, boy. You're safe here." The words cracked, but the horse's stillness made them whole again. The sound of gravel crunching broke the quiet. Luke turned to see Ethan leaning on the fence outside, half hidden in the shadows. The boy's eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open. He let you," Ethan stammered. "He actually let you." Luke nodded slowly. "First time." The boy swallowed. "How?" "By waiting," Luke said simply. "By not asking more than he can give." Ethan looked away, shoulders hunched. "Guess that's why nobody waits on me." Luke opened his mouth, then closed it. The weight of the boy's words struck deep. He wanted to tell him he was wrong, that someone always cared. But he knew too well that sometimes the world moved on too fast, leaving wounds behind. The stallion lifted his head, ears swiveling toward the boy. Ethan stepped closer to the fence, hand trembling against the top rail. But when he reached out, the horse shied back a step, the moment gone. The boy's face fell. "Doesn't mean never," Luke said quickly. "Just means not yet." Ethan scuffed his shoe in the dirt, then muttered, "Maybe I'm just not worth the wait." He turned and walked off into the night, his figure swallowed by the darkness. Luke stood in the silence that followed, the stallion watching him with eyes that seemed to understand more than an animal should. He stroked the horse's neck once more. "He's worth the wait," Luke murmured. "Just like you were." The lantern flickered, shadows swaying across scarred wood and tired beams. Outside, the night was wide and endless, but inside the barn, something had shifted. Trust had lowered its head at last. When Luke finally left, he paused at the door and looked back. The stallion was lying down in the hay, head turned toward the spot where Luke had stood. It wasn't surrender. It was something stronger, a beginning. The trust that had bloomed in the barn was delicate, like frost crystals forming overnight. By morning it glittered with promise, but by midday it could melt into nothing. Luke knew this. He had lived it. Those rare days when grief seemed to loosen its grip, only for some sound, some memory, to drag him back under. The stallion was no different. For a few days, the horse followed Luke along the fence line when he walked the pasture. Not close enough to touch, not bold enough to press his muzzle against a palm again, but near enough to suggest he was willing. Luke spoke less now, saving his words for when they mattered. Sometimes silence was the language that built bridges. But one afternoon, as Luke mended a sagging gate, the rumble of an unfamiliar truck rolled up the road. Dust plumed, and out stepped Dean Harlow, clean boots sinking into the dirt as if the land itself should yield to him. Sheriff Collins followed, his hat low against the glare, his jaw set with the kind of tension that told Luke he hadn't wanted to be here. Dean's smile was wide, too white. "Afternoon, Harrison. Thought I'd check in on that dangerous animal you brought home. Whole town's still talking." His eyes flicked toward the stallion, grazing not far away. "Looks calm enough now, but give it time." Luke tightened the wire with his pliers, jaw working. "What do you want, Dean?" "What I've always wanted. This place. That horse is your ticket out, you'll see. One wrong move, and Collins here will have no choice but to declare him a menace." The sheriff's silence was worse than words. His eyes avoided Luke's, and that alone told the farmer everything. Pressure was mounting. Complaints from townsfolk, fear stirred by Dean, all of it weighing on the law. The stallion seemed to sense the tension. He raised his head, ears pinned, nostrils flaring. When Dean stepped closer to the fence, the horse lunged forward, striking the rails so hard the wood shuddered. Dean stumbled back, cursing. "See? That's proof enough." Luke moved quickly, voice low but firm. "Easy, boy. Not today." He stepped between the man and the horse, his own body becoming the barrier. The stallion's eyes blazed, his chest heaving, but he stilled just enough to keep the fence intact. Dean dusted off his shirt, fury replacing his smug grin. "One of these days, Harrison, that animal's going to end you. And when it happens, don't say I didn't warn you." He stalked back to his truck, gravel spitting beneath the tires as he left. Collins lingered, removing his hat, rubbing his temple. "Luke, you've got to understand. Folks are scared. If he hurts someone, anyone, I won't be able to protect him." Luke swallowed hard, nodding once. "I'll take care of him. No one else will get near." That night, the storm returned, not from the sky, but from within the barn. The horse paced, struck the boards, reared against the stall. The fragile trust of the lowered head seemed like a memory dissolving in the dark. Luke sat in his chair, lantern burning low, heart heavy. "They want me to give up on you," he whispered. "They want proof you're a monster." The stallion slammed his hooves again, sparks of straw flying. Luke pressed forward, ignoring the thud of fear in his chest. "But I know better. I've seen you different." The horse turned sharply, eyes rolling white, then stopped. For a long moment they stared at each other. Two souls on opposite sides of a thin barrier, each daring the other to break. Slowly, painfully, the stallion lowered his head again. Not as far as before, not with the same surrender, but enough. Enough to say the ember was still alive. Luke reached through the slats, his fingertips brushing the coarse mane. His own voice broke. "We both have shadows, don't we? But shadows don't mean the light is gone." The barn quieted. Outside, crickets sang, and the wind sighed across the field. Inside, man and horse stood in the fragile stillness that comes only after storms, knowing the battle was not finished, but the bond had not broken. When Luke finally rose to leave, he glanced back. The stallion stood steady, watching him go. Not pacing, not rearing, just watching. Luke whispered into the night air, "That's enough for now." The barn smelled of damp wood and old hay when Luke returned that night, a lantern swinging from his hand. The stallion stood restless in the corner, head low but muscles taut, as though the shadows themselves were enough to summon memories he could not shake. Luke set the lantern on its hook, the light flickering across scarred walls, and lowered himself into the chair he'd worn smooth with long hours of keeping watch. He rubbed his hands together, the sound rough in the silence. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice steady at first, then faltering. "Not sure you'll understand, but I can't carry it alone anymore." The horse flicked his ears, nostrils flaring. He didn't move closer, but he didn't shy either. Luke took that as permission. "I wasn't there the day it happened." His throat tightened around the words. "The accident. They told me it was quick. Machinery doesn't give warnings. One slip and it's over. But I can't stop thinking. What if I'd been there? What if I'd caught it before it went wrong?" His voice broke, his breath catching as he forced himself to continue. "My boy died alone, and I was too far away to help." The stallion shifted, hooves pressing into the straw, tail swishing, eyes dark as if reflecting the pain in Luke's voice. Luke leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. "I've carried that guilt like a stone in my chest. Every time I look at you, I see another soul who's been failed. Maybe that's why I couldn't walk away at the auction. I thought if I could save you, then maybe—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The stallion blew out a long breath, soft and unhurried. It was no answer, no absolution, but in the quiet it felt like listening. Luke closed his eyes, the weight of silence pressing heavy yet strangely gentle. "I can't bring him back," he whispered. "But I can stand here with you. I won't turn away when you fight, when you panic. I'll be here, because no one should be left alone with their fear." Minutes stretched. The lantern hissed faintly, the flame bowing low, then rising again. Slowly the stallion stepped forward. His hooves made no sound in the straw, but his presence filled the space. He stopped at the stall door, head lowering until his muzzle pressed against the wood. Luke raised a trembling hand and set his palm flat on the other side. Wood between them, but still. Contact. His eyes blurred, tears rising, not of weakness, but of release. "That's enough," he murmured. "That's more than enough." Behind him, the night pressed close against the barn walls. Crickets sang, and a lone owl called from the cottonwoods. But within, the weight shifted. No longer a stone grinding in his chest, but something lighter, something that felt like breath after too long underwater. The stallion stayed near until Luke's breathing evened. When the man finally stood, legs stiff, he felt as though a confession had been heard, not by a priest or a neighbor, but by another wounded being who knew what it was to suffer without words. As Luke slid the barn door closed behind him, he whispered into the night, "You're not the only one who needs saving." The stars were clear, brittle and sharp against the black sky. Luke tilted his head back, inhaled the cold air, and for the first time in many months, he felt lighter walking back to the empty house. The silence inside no longer rang as punishment, but as space waiting to be filled. And though nothing outside had changed, the debts, the failing fences, the whispers of neighbors, inside Luke, something had shifted. He had spoken his truth. The stallion had listened. And in that fragile exchange, a new kind of strength had been born. The morning after Luke's confession felt different. The sky was the same pale blue, the fields still brittle with frost, but something inside him had loosened. He moved through chores with steadier hands, the silence no longer pressing so heavily against his ribs. The stallion trailed him along the fence, not close, but not distant either, an unspoken shadow that mirrored each step. By midday, word had already spread. In towns like theirs, news traveled faster than weather fronts. Folks at the feed store whispered that Dean Harlow had stormed off Luke's property, red-faced and sputtering about lawsuits. Others repeated claims that the horse had nearly broken down the fence. Fear mixed with gossip until the whole county seemed to hum with one question: how long before Luke lost control? That afternoon, Maggie returned, her truck rattling into the yard with a bale of hay in the back. She didn't wait for permission, just unloaded it near the barn and leaned against the tailgate. "You can't keep doing this alone," she said. "I know you think you can, but sooner or later, you'll need help." Luke wiped sweat from his brow. "Help costs money I don't have." "Not all help costs money," Maggie replied. Her gaze flicked to the stallion, who was watching from the pasture. "Some of us just don't like seeing things suffer. You or him." Before Luke could answer, another truck pulled into the drive. This one belonged to Mrs. Carter, the widow who ran the diner in town. She climbed out with a covered dish in her hands, the kind of casserole folks brought when they didn't have the right words. "Heard you've been keeping late nights," she said, setting it on the porch. "Thought you might need something hot." Luke blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't expected kindness, not after weeks of whispers. But before he could thank her, Ethan appeared from behind the diner truck, his hoodie pulled tight against the wind. The boy carried a small bundle of carrots, their green tops still damp with soil. "Grandma said these were extra," he muttered, though Luke suspected he'd pulled them from her garden himself. He held them out awkwardly, eyes flicking toward the stallion. "For him." Luke took the carrots, rough hands brushing the boy's. "He'll appreciate it." Ethan shrugged, but his gaze lingered on the horse. The stallion had stepped closer to the fence now, ears forward, nostrils flaring at the scent of carrots. Luke walked slowly to the fence line, holding one out flat on his palm. To his surprise, the horse took it eagerly, crunching loudly, juice running down his chin. The boy's eyes widened. "He did," Luke said, smiling faintly. "Want to try?" Ethan froze, torn between fear and longing. Finally, he shook his head. "Not yet." The moment passed quietly, but it left a warmth Luke hadn't felt in months. For the first time since the accident, people had gathered in his yard not to condemn, but to share. Maggie unloading hay, Mrs. Carter bringing food. Ethan, braver than he knew, carrying carrots to a horse everyone else called a monster. By evening, more neighbors stopped by. Jake Thornton, the old auctioneer, came with a sack of feed, muttering that it was extra stock. Even Sheriff Collins drove by, parking at the end of the lane. Not a moan. Entering, but tipping his hat in a gesture that said more than words. Luke stood on the porch as dusk fell, watching the yard fill with small acts of quiet defiance against fear. The stallion grazed near the fence, unbothered by the visitors, as if sensing the shift in the air. For weeks, the farm had felt like a battlefield, Luke alone against whispers and doubt. Now it felt, if only for a moment, like a gathering place. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the yard empty again, Luke walked to the fence. The stallion lifted his head, eyes meeting his in the dim light. Luke held the last carrot from Ethan's bundle between his fingers. The horse stepped forward, took it gently, and lingered long after the crunching stopped. You see that? Luke whispered. They came. Not for me. For us. The stallion blew out a soft breath, ears flicking forward. Luke leaned on the rail, the chill of the night settling around him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. A spark had caught. Small, fragile, but enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, they weren't fighting this battle alone. The town's harvest festival arrived on a Saturday, the kind of crisp autumn day that smelled of roasted corn and cinnamon. Main Street was strung with orange pennants. Bales of straw lined the sidewalks, and children darted between booths where pies cooled and jars of honey gleamed in the sun. For generations, the festival had been the season's highlight, a reminder that even in hard years, there was still something to gather, still something to celebrate. Luke hadn't planned on attending. He preferred his quiet routines, the rhythm of chores and evenings in the barn. But Ethan appeared at his porch that morning, hands jammed deep in his hoodie pockets. "You coming?" the boy asked, voice too casual to be anything but nervous. Luke shook his head. "Festivals aren't much for me these days." Ethan kicked at the porch step. "People will talk more if you don't show. Say you're hiding." He hesitated, then added softly, "They're already talking about him." Luke understood. Rumors had grown louder, fed by Dean Harlow's constant whispering. People feared the stallion, imagined him charging fences, tearing through fields. If Luke stayed away, those fears would only deepen. Reluctantly, he nodded. "All right, let's go." The fairground buzzed with music from a local band, fiddles sharp against the hum of conversation. Luke walked among the booths, hat low, Ethan trailing at his side. Heads turned. Some nodded politely, others avoided his gaze. A few whispered openly. Luke endured it, jaw tight. Toward afternoon, a demonstration was announced, a showcase of local livestock for children and visitors. Families gathered at the small arena, cheering as ponies trotted in circles and 4-H calves were led by proud owners. Dean Harlow stood near the rail, his smile thin and knowing. When Luke saw him signal to the announcer, dread coiled in his stomach. "And now," the announcer boomed, "a special sight. Harrison's stallion, the one you've all heard about." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Luke's chest tightened. He hadn't agreed to this, but Dean's voice rang clear. "If that horse is as tame as Harrison claims, let's see it here, before everyone." Luke's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to refuse, to walk away. But eyes were on him, waiting, judging. Ethan tugged his sleeve. "If you don't, they'll never believe," the boy whispered. So Luke went home, hitched the trailer, and loaded the stallion with quiet patience. The horse resisted at first, snorting, pawing at the ramp, but Luke offered an apple, his voice steady. "It's just another kind of fence, boy. We'll face it together." Finally, the stallion stepped in, the gate closing behind him. At the fairground, murmurs rose as the black horse emerged, scarred and imposing under the autumn light. Parents pulled children closer. Dean smirked. "Let's see what your miracle amounts to, Harrison." Luke led the stallion into the ring, rope loose in his hand. The crowd pressed forward, breath held. At first the horse tossed his head, ears pinned, eyes rolling white. The noise, the smells, the strange press of bodies. It all threatened to break him. Then, just as panic swelled, Ethan stumbled. He had been trying to squeeze through the fence for a better look, but his foot caught, sending him sprawling into the ring. A collective gasp surged. The boy lay frozen, eyes wide, as the stallion swung toward him, muscles bunching. "Ethan!" Luke shouted, heart lurching. The crowd braced for disaster. Dean's voice cut sharp. "I told you! Monster!" But the horse did not strike. Instead, he halted, hooves skidding in the dirt. He lowered his head slowly, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the boy's arm. Then, in a motion so gentle it silenced the crowd, he nudged Ethan upright, standing between him and the noise. His body became a shield, his head dipping as if to say, "You're safe here." The arena was silent but for the sound of the boy's ragged breathing. Then cheers broke out, scattered at first, then swelling until the air vibrated with relief. Ethan clung to the horse's mane, laughing through tears. Luke's throat closed, emotion tightening until he could barely breathe. Dean's face drained of color. He muttered something about luck and shoved his way through the crowd, but no one listened. All eyes were on the stallion who had been called a monster and had proven, in the most public way possible, that he was something else entirely. Luke stroked the horse's neck, his voice steady though his eyes stung. "That's my boy. You showed them." The stallion snorted, ears flicking forward, standing tall in the autumn light. For the first time, Luke saw not just survival in those eyes, but pride. That night, as they returned home, Ethan rode in the passenger seat, Carrot still clutched in his lap. "He saved me," the boy whispered. Luke nodded, eyes on the road. "Maybe he saved us both." In the trailer behind them, the stallion shifted, the sound of hooves steady as a heartbeat. The festival ended with the sound of fiddles and laughter fading into the cold Montana night, but Luke carried the weight of what had happened long after the crowd went home. The image of the stallion lowering his head to shield Ethan burned in his mind, a gesture so deliberate it was impossible to dismiss as chance. For a moment, the town had seen what Luke had always known, that beneath the scars, beneath the fear, was a soul worth saving. But the following morning, reality returned like frost crawling over windows. Dean Harlow's truck idled at the end of Luke's drive, gleaming chrome catching the pale sun. He didn't bother knocking, just leaned on his horn until Luke stepped out onto the porch. "Congratulations on your little show yesterday," Dean drawled, his grin sharp as a blade. "Had everyone eating out of your hand. But don't think for a second it changes the law. One slip, one accident, and Collins will have no choice but to sign the order. You can't build a future on a freak." Luke's jaw tightened. "I'm not building on him. I'm building with him." Dean's smile curdled. "We'll see how long that lasts." He climbed back into his truck and roared away, gravel spitting under his tires. The threat lingered even after the dust settled. Luke walked to the fence, where the stallion stood grazing calmly, as though unaware of the weight pressing down on them both. Ethan arrived soon after, his steps slower than usual. The boy still carried the glow of yesterday's miracle, but beneath it was fear. "What if Dean's right?" Ethan asked, his voice small. "What if people change their minds again?" Luke rested a hand on the rail, watching the stallion flick his tail at flies. "Then I'll make my choice. And it'll be mine, not theirs." That evening, Maggie stopped by with a stack of papers tucked under her arm. "I've been talking to some folks," she said, setting them on Luke's kitchen table. "There are rescue groups, sanctuaries. If it comes to it, there are places where he could live safe, without the constant threats." Luke stared at the papers, the print swimming. To give the horse away felt like tearing something vital from his chest. Yet he knew Maggie wasn't wrong. If Dean succeeded in turning fear into law, there would be no second chances. He walked out to the barn, Maggie following silently. The stallion stood inside, ears pricked, eyes steady on him. Luke leaned against the door. "They want me to decide where you belong," he murmured, as if belonging was something other people could vote on. The horse blew a warm breath, stepping closer until his muzzle brushed the wood. Luke lifted his hand to meet him, palm flat against the grain. For a long while he stood that way, Maggie watching quietly, until the weight of choice pressed harder than he could bear. Later, when the barn was dark, and only the stars lit the pasture, Luke sat on the porch with Ethan beside him. The boy's legs dangled, his sneakers scuffing the boards. "You think you'll send him away?" Ethan asked. Luke didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the dark silhouette in the field. The stallion's head was high, his form solid against the horizon. "I think," Luke said at last, "that sometimes the hardest choice isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when letting go is love too." Ethan turned sharply. "But he saved me. He's not just some horse. He's—" The boy's voice cracked. "He's the first one who didn't look at me like I was broken." Luke's chest ached. He reached out, ruffling the boy's hair the way he used to with his own son. "Then maybe that's the answer. Maybe he stays. Not for me, but for you." The boy's eyes widened, tears catching the lantern light. "You mean it?" Luke nodded, though the choice weighed heavy. "If we fight for him, we fight together. No halfway." Out in the pasture, the stallion lifted his head toward the house as though he had heard. His ears flicked forward, his dark shape steady against the rising moon. Luke felt the gravity of his decision settle, sharp and certain. Whatever came next, Dean's threats, the town's doubts, he would not stand aside. The choice was made. The first frost of October glazed the barley stubble silver, and the air carried the kind of stillness that only comes when a season tips quietly into another. Luke stood on the porch, mug of coffee warming his hands, and watched as the stallion trotted the fence line with his head high, breath puffing in the cold morning. He no longer looked like the broken creature from the auction. His stride was long, his body filled with muscle and purpose, and when he stopped to look back toward the house, his eyes carried calm instead of fear. It had been weeks since the harvest festival, and the town had begun to change its tune. Where there had been whispers of danger, now there were nods of respect. Neighbors who once crossed the street now waved as they passed. Children pressed their noses to the school bus windows, pointing when they spotted the black horse grazing in the field. The word monster had faded, replaced by something gentler, though no one seemed to settle on a name that fit better than the one Luke already whispered. Partner. Dean Harlow had not returned, at least not yet. Rumors swirled of financial trouble, of failed deals in another county, and though Luke knew the man wasn't finished scheming, he also knew he no longer stood alone. Maggie stopped by every week with supplies, her laughter filling the kitchen that had been silent too long. Mrs. Carter made sure he never lacked a hot meal, sometimes sending Ethan with a dish and instructions to make the old man eat it before it gets cold. Even Sheriff Collins, once torn between law and loyalty, now tipped his hat when he drove by, as if acknowledging that some battles were worth choosing sides in. Ethan had changed most of all. The boy spent every spare hour at the farm, mucking stalls, hauling water, learning the rhythm of chores. At first, he worked with a kind of desperation, as if trying to prove something to himself. But over time, his movements grew steady, patient. The stallion responded in kind, no longer shying at the boy's approach. One crisp evening, as Luke leaned on the fence, he watched with quiet pride as the horse lowered his head and allowed Ethan's trembling hand to rest against his muzzle. The boy's grin was bright enough to burn through the dusk. "You see that?" Ethan shouted, breathless with wonder. "I see it," Luke answered, his throat tight. "He chose you." The farm began to feel alive again. Luke repaired the roof of the barn, replaced fence posts, even planted rye in a corner of the field. The work was heavy, but his body no longer carried it like a punishment. Each task felt like a step forward, not just for him, but for everyone who had gathered under this unlikely banner of second chances. On a Sunday morning, the town held a small gathering at the churchyard. Not for a funeral, not for gossip, but for a blessing of the harvest and the animals. Luke led the stallion there. Rope loose, each step watched by faces that once doubted, but now believed. When the preacher laid a hand gently on the horse's neck and spoke of resilience, of how even scarred things can hold grace, Luke bowed his head, not in prayer, but in gratitude. That night, after the neighbors had gone and the lanterns were dim, Luke sat on the porch beside Ethan. The boy leaned against the railing, boots dangling. The stallion grazed quietly in the pasture, fireflies rising around him like sparks. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Ethan asked suddenly. Luke shook his head. "This is where I belong now." He paused, then added, "Where we belong." The boy smiled, and for the first time, it wasn't a smile trying to hide sorrow. It was simply joy. As the chill deepened, Luke stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. He looked out at the pasture, at the horse who had been branded a monster and had become something far greater. A reminder that brokenness is not the end of the story. The scars remained, both on the horse's hide and in Luke's heart, but they were no longer marks of ruin. They were proof of survival, of endurance, of love that had learned to stay. The moon rose, pale and bright, casting long shadows across the fields. Luke whispered into the night, words carried by the wind. "We made it, boy. We're still here." And in the stillness of that new autumn, with a boy at his side and a horse in his field, Luke felt the truth settle deep. Sometimes salvation doesn't arrive with trumpets or miracles. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of a lowered head, a hand not withdrawn, and the courage to keep choosing one another day after day. They called him a monster, a black stallion no one dared to touch. At a dusty Montana auction, the crowd mocked, the sheriff warned, and a ruthless landowner waited for him to fail. But when one grieving farmer stretched out his hand, everything began to change. What followed was a battle against storms, fear, and betrayal, until the moment the monster revealed a heart no one expected.